Hey guys, well, one of the great joys of messing around with this stuff and talking about baseball and making videos and stuff is the fact that I sometimes will forget what I've covered before and what I haven't. Kind of an embarrassing thing to admit, especially since I'm not really that old, though my wife will call me grandpa. I'm definitely not that old, as you can see, but from time to time I will forget what exactly I've covered and what I haven't. I think I've written about this, but I don't think that I have a video about it. I went back to check and to make sure. What we want to talk about today is some of the greatest defenses in baseball history. It was probably about 3 weeks or so ago that I had a video talking about the greatest offenses as determined by the Domination Index. Now, remember, the Domination Index is just one way of looking at this, and it does have its weakness. The weakness is that it doesn't adjust for park factors at all. It works in terms of the overall Domination Index because you look at runs scored and runs allowed. So at least theoretically, if you have a hitting-friendly ballpark, you'll get extra runs scored, but the runs allowed will look pretty bad. And if conversely, you have a very hitting-unfriendly ballpark, like you're in Houston in the early 1980s, you'll get a low number of runs allowed relative to the league, but you won't score a lot of runs. And so when you look at the two combined, you can figure something out. What you'll see is that there will be a very significant difference between the two, and then the overall Domination Index will give you, in theory, an idea of whether you're one of the best teams in baseball history or not. Now, I think we've already talked about, what about teams in the pennant race versus teams like the 39 Yankees that kind of dominated everything, didn't really have many games that were that meaningful later in the season, right? These are all a whole bunch of other things that you have to take into consideration. And I mean, we'll look at that a little bit later. What we want to look at right now, though, is much as we did with the greatest offenses of all time, we want to look at some of the greatest defenses of all time without adjusting for anything, just for fun, to see what comes of it. And what I'll tell you is that one thing you have to keep in mind is that there is a difference between pitching and defense, right? And what I mean by this is that these teams are not necessarily great pitching teams. These are teams that have great overall defense relative to the league. That's something that you have to keep in mind. Pitching is actually part of defense. We tend to separate it from defense because we have this sort of bias built within us that says that the pitcher is somehow the most important part of the defense, and that therefore, because he handles the ball in every single pitch, obviously, we have to put him up on some kind of pedestal or give him some sort of extra benefit of the doubt or whatever it may be. Is that the way it's supposed to be? Is that not the way it's supposed to be? I don't know. I'm not really here to answer that question. I'm just here to tell you that defense includes pitching and fielding, and they work together. I know there's a lot of people who talk in baseball about defensive independent pitching or fielding independent pitching. I know that there are mathematical reasons why you want to look at that. What I'm telling you is that from a practical standpoint, it's probably not really that important. It really isn't. When you're looking overall at runs not allowed for the purposes of this, I don't care if it's because they had a great pitcher or 2 or 5 or 12, or if it's because they had great defense. I figure that both of those are dealing with preventing runs from being scored. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and just jump straight into it. There you go, and here's our beautiful index. Hopefully that is readable for all of you. You can see here that I did include this version of the Excel sheet I'm using, or the Open Office, what is this called? The LibreOffice Calc sheet. Includes the gap reading. So this is the difference between the run score Domination Index reading and the runs allowed reading. This way you can see which teams, have a significant difference, which is probably where the park factors are coming into play. And so who are on top of the National League? Well, the 91 Dodgers, a team that just lost out in the pennant, ended up being number 1 up there with a rather impressive 2.288 runs allowed away, standard deviations away in terms of their runs allowed. So they gave up 565 runs in a league that gave up 662.917 on average. Of course, the average isn't the important thing. The important thing is that standard deviation of 42.797, which meant that the 91 Dodgers actually had a defense that really, really stands out. unfortunately, their offense wasn't that great. That's why they lost out to the Braves by such a small margin. Next, you see the 2006 Padres. 1900 Pirates are an interesting team, a team that we don't usually talk about. The 1900 Pirates tend to play well if you play a 1900 replay in one of the few games that allows you to do that. I think there's probably only 2 or 3, maybe 3 that allow you to do that. The 1900 Pirates are a much better team than you think. Of course, they're not as good technically as the 1902 Pirates, but the reason for that is because the rest of the National League got worse, not because they got better. We remember this team, the 2017 Dodgers. Not too much to say there extra. Other than that, their runs scored was pretty much average, maybe a little bit above. 81 Astros is a team that you might not think about too much. I would think about the 1980 Astros, but this is another team that had a very, very good performance in terms of not allowing a lot of runs. I mean, 331 runs allowed in that league, not a heck of a lot. Then the 48 Boston Braves, a team that we're familiar with because of the 49 replay. And here you have the Dodgers against. Remember, every time you see the Dodgers popping up here, it's usually because of that ballpark. 1917 New York Giants, which is not a huge surprise. And then they are followed by the 95 Atlanta Braves. Not a surprising team that much either. One thing I want to point out here, and you can keep going down the list, I mean, there's the 1906 Cubs, so that's definitely a very strong team. 2022 Dodgers, we've talked about before, an incredibly strong team if you ignore schedule issues. And so on and so forth. One interesting thing to mention, though, is this 89 Dodgers team that was not really close to the pennant. I think they finished under 500. They have this huge gap because they were one of the best defensive teams in baseball history, but this anemic, awful offense makes them one of the teams in history with the biggest gap possible. In other words, that was an awful offense to have in contrast to their great defense. And in the end, their domination index rating is actually negative. Interesting for a team that is number 10 on the list of top teams of all time in terms of runs allowed. We'll move over to the American League really quick. And I just realized, of course, and you already know this, that the 2023 season's over, which means I need to create this for the newest season. So that'll come by and by. As with so many other projects, the fact is not that I don't want to do it. It's just that there's a whole lot of things that I want to do. And this one ends up being put by the wayside. 67 White Sox are a team that I think many of you remember. I don't. This is a team that was very close to finishing in first place. I think they were like 1 or 2 games out by the end of the season. Another team with a really big gap because that offense was not quite there. Hitless wonders, definitely, but they had very good pitching and defense. And you'll see here, there's not a whole lot of Chicago White Sox teams that show up, maybe 66, but not a whole lot up here, which tells me just from a glance that it probably wasn't the ballpark. It's probably the team's construction. We all know about the 1990 Oakland Athletics. Don't have to talk about them. 23 Yankees are interesting. It's interesting because you wouldn't think about this team being a better pitching team relative to the league than a hitting team, but it's true. This was actually a very, very good defensive team. 2017 Indians, I think I would argue, is also a similar case. 99 Red Sox is another team that would surprise you because they were a little bit worse than league average in terms of runs scored. I guess Pedro helped them. And then, of course, the 98 Yankees, need we say more? 74 Oakland A's, another team that's obvious. 81 Yankees, maybe not so obvious on the list, but another team that does well. And you see so many Yankees teams on here. Remember, this is after the construction of Yankee Stadium, which, again, is probably a sign that the Yankees or the Yankee Stadium is more of a pitcher's park than we think. And look at that, the 2022 Astros. Amazing how both 2022 teams end up showing up in the ultimate offensive era of baseball we have today. I guess it's not so much, but if you concentrate enough really good pitchers on these teams, you find yourself sort of vaulting up and through the regular season very successfully. Anything else interesting here? Of course, those Baltimore Orioles teams. Not much of a question about the 69 Orioles. Anybody would tell you that this team had an excellent pitching staff. 79 Orioles might be a little bit of a surprise. The other real big surprise, the 83 Texas Rangers. Can you name any of their starting pitchers without looking it up? Or how about the 1930 Washington Senators? So I have to go digging into the history books. But no, the one that really surprises me coming in at number 29 is the 27 Yankees. And it's interesting to see that, of course, their offense was a little bit better relative to the league than the defense, but it's interesting to see how high they rank among American League teams in terms of overall domination. 27 Yankees we think of as murderer's row and that great offensive attack, but their defense was also excellent. I would argue that they're probably one of the best balanced of the really great teams in baseball history, right? And you can see that because of look at this gap, which is very, very small. This team is as good offensively as it is defensively, very similar to, here's another one, the 95 Cleveland Indians, another team that probably a team you would think more highly of its defense of than the 27 Yankees. That's another thing to keep in mind when you go through all of this. Anyway, there you have it. Just wanted to have a little quick talk about this. Hopefully you find this as interesting as I do. It's just something to play around with. It's not, as I said, it's not necessarily super significant. There's a lot of stuff that we could adjust for that we're not adjusing for here. This is just sort of a simple look at sort of an interesting way to look at these statistics, and an interesting way to think about teams that might pop up in projects that you have ongoing. So with that, wish you a pleasant day. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.